Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be going through a review of the book Radical Spirits by Ann Braude. This is the third book in an ever-growing series demonstrating the theological and spiritual underpinnings of the feminist, intersectional, and critical X studies movements, and demonstrating conclusively that these things are religious in nature. With that short introduction out of the way, let's get into the book proper. As the introduction to the second edition notes, this book not only aims to demonstrate that several key figures in the proto-feminist suffrage movements were religious, in the form of spiritualism, but notes that it also aims to demonstrate the importance of spiritualism as a movement to the general cultural and political milieu of the 19th century, that this religion should be taken seriously as it, at the time, offered a legitimate response to 19th century organized religions, in the varying forms of Christianity prevalent in the Americas. I once again feel compelled to quote a paragraph from this introduction as an encapsulation of the modern desire to eliminate the importance of the spiritualist movement from history by modern progressives and feminists. Quoting from the introduction, "Taking spiritualism seriously as a religion means that a cadre of female mediums who spread the movement should be seen as religious figures, rather than as impressionable dupes. When I embarked on the research that eventually became Radical Spirits, more than one person asked whether I really wanted to tar women's rights with the taint of spiritualism. Wouldn't that be bad for the movement? At the time, I viewed these questions as curiously inconsistent with the goal of women's history and religious studies. All historians, I believed, were committed to the quest for truth, whether or not they liked where it led. Historians of women, in particular, needed to restore what had been excluded from the historical record, not to impose new sets of blinders. Students of religion aspired not to judge specific faiths, but rather to understand and interpret them." Indeed, later in the introduction, Braude mentions there has been a strange dualism of thought regarding the separation of religion and science, in how these things are recorded as being important to cultural progress, stating that there is a, quote, presupposed binary between faith and reason, and to privilege the side of the binary historically associated with the masculine, by ignoring or downplaying the role of religious motivations, experiences, and meaning systems. It seemed to me historians downplayed areas of American culture in which women might be more important, end quote. This, I think, is true, not for a feminist-interpreted desire to oppress women or write them out of history, but increasingly as a feminist-led desire to be, for lack of better terms, taken seriously, and thus attempting to shed their belief system's history of wacky religious elements that might make people write them off as being silly New Age superstitions. This, combined with the modern progressive orthodoxy folding into itself the dialectic materialism of Hegel, as well as Marxist materialist thought, leads to an uncomfortable position of having to justify their worldview in material, non-metaphysical terms, something that is surely an impossibility when much of their worldview is spiritual in origin, something that Hegel's dialectics, including the materialist, relies heavily upon in the form of the immanentist nature of his systems. Once again, at this point, I find myself thinking back to our first book, Women's Reality by Schaef, 1981, and her assertions that logic is part of the male system and male system thinking, creating social constructs so as to cripple the theological female system to prevent the process of spiritual attainment and transcendence. Books such as these, and all others in this series, is why it is so curious that when confronted with the truth of spiritual origins to the religion of feminism, its neophytes will scoff and guffaw and tell you to educate yourself and read a book. This is merely a symptom of this religious origin having been written out of their canon, not by evil, oppressive male system thinkers, but by their religion's own clergy. Indeed, it is with this modern knowledge that we can look back on Braude's claims made in the Radical Spirits introduction in 1989 and see that the observation of women's social and spiritual influence being scrubbed from popular knowledge and record was completely correct. Of note throughout the introduction to the second edition are a few other observations, one of which is on page 20, where Braude observes that women play a significant role in many new and emerging movements, including in leadership positions, but that this contribution is diminished or forgotten over time if those movements become marginalized or institutionalized. This is, I think, broadly correct. However, I think that once again this needs clarification. The feminist position on this would agree to the premise, but conclude that this is a result of a patriarchal male-dominated society wanting to sideline women and only privilege the men of certain movements. However, I think a more correct observation would be because, when social agitation happens, especially if those agitations turn violent, males of those movements would historically be more likely to die in service to their cause or face state execution, if such things are permissible within their nation as a result of their political agitations. Women in similar positions will often receive lesser punishments and be less likely to die for their beliefs, or even face violence as a result of holding a belief. People martyred for their cause are more likely to be remembered than those who aren't. This is true for both succeeding and failing movements. As for women being forgotten when agitated change becomes institutionalized, this is something important to remember. Women and proto-feminists did succeed in their endeavors. But once again, we have to look at risk versus reward. Men are more likely to take the risk of proposing legal changes that push these female-desired causes, more so than the women themselves. Indeed, studies have demonstrated, and even Schaaf 1981 agreed, women are less likely to push their ideas forward themselves, preferring for men to do that job for them. This is known colloquially as power by proxy, and is a strategy used by women throughout time to afflict change upon their environment while providing insulation from pushback and failure. So we once again find ourselves in the position of these influential and powerful women being potentially forgotten, not because of an oppressive misogynistic society hell-bent on the destruction of the female, but because it would appear to be a choice made by these powerful and influential women as a means of protecting themselves from social harm, allowing men to take that reputational damage instead of themselves. The next notable revelation in the introduction would be the observation of feminist activists writing their own religious history out of their movement by frequently using labels such as secular feminism, which would inherently suggest there is a theological feminism to make such a subtitle necessary. This is backed up by observations of the behaviour of the National Organization of Women, and how some of its issues were deeply concerned with Christianity, female ordination, and church service. This would later expand out to include other religions. Introduction. The original introduction begins on page 1, and thus marks our movement into the main body of the book. This chapter begins with a heartbreaking account of Annie Denton Cridge, and the loss of her first child within the first months of his life. As her child lay dying of illness, she claimed to have witnessed the spirits of her parents, the child's grandparents, watching over her baby's couch, quote, waiting to bear his sweet spirit away, end quote. This was the genesis of Cridge's spirit-seeing skills, and beginning of her new spiritualist faith. This would be part of an ongoing rejection of Methodist doctrines, which were marked by her, a year previously, in her autobiography, My Soul's Thraldom and Its Deliverance, while attempting to find religious purpose that would not, by her own words, quote, turn heaven into hell, end quote. She discovered mesmerism, Owenism, socialism, and spiritualism. This is of note here because in our last book, Occult Feminism, it is notable how often these early progressive spiritualists, suffragists, suffragettes, and proto-feminists would dabble in left-wing politics, such as varying degrees of anarchism, socialism, and the beginnings of what would be codified in later decades into communism and Marxism. This would make sense, as on page 2 the author goes on to mention early spiritualism and how it held two distinct advantages, as illustrated by Cridge and her husband: rebellion against death and rebellion against authority, specifically in the form of the varying flavours of Christianity, most notably because of spiritualism's acceptance of female authority, something unheard of in various Christian sects, outside of a brief mention of exception for Quakers. As is later observed, spiritualism seemed poised to take advantage of a crisis of faith in the predominantly Christian culture of the era. With the rising of science, the God-shaped holes in the universe were rapidly being filled in, with understanding provided by the natural sciences. Spiritualism was able to ride the success of this new science, and appear to be part of scientific development and knowledge. This is because spiritualism would make use of these new sciences, in the form of magnets and electricity, to name but a few things. A prime example of this is the case of Samuel Morse, who requested $30,000 to construct an experimental telegraph line from Washington to Baltimore. He found very little understanding of electricity in the nation's governing body. Indeed, there were sarcastic remarks and parallels drawn between the use of electricity and magnetism employed by Mesmers. However, this lack of understanding is what led many spiritualists to be able to ply their trade, with substandard explanation or simple misunderstandings of how technologies such as electricity and magnetism would function, making the case that this electrical communication and its success was because of the intelligence of disembodied spirits. This would later lead on to the use of magnets and electricity to communicate with the dead, a process that can still be found happening today amongst self-proclaimed ghost hunters. The key takeaway to this is the observation that via an immanentist view of the world, the notion that God created the universe with rules and that humans can understand these rules, spiritualism rose to a degree of prominence by effectively promising closeness not only with the dead, but potentially with God himself. This was a strong allure to a great many people of the day. This combined with an inherently individualist construction, wherein mediums were an authority unto themselves with no fixed orthodoxy, and this allowed legitimate and more individually intimate understandings of the universe and godhood than organized religion. Chapter 1. Chapter 1 introduces us to a cast of characters included in the story of Quaker abolitionists Amy and Isaac Post, residents of Rochester, New York, and the rumors of rapping noises in the area heard by Margaret and Amy Fox. As noted, the story would have been a relative nothing had it not been for the Post's interest in these rappings and a variety of fellow reform activists at the time. This would lead on to form a proto-seancing and communication with whatever was making these rapping noises. Through the use of a read-out-loud alphabet, messages were allegedly relayed revealing the identities of the spirits supposedly present. What is most interesting about these events was the relative overrepresentation of Quaker reformers present. This is mostly notable because the Quakers, as opposed to other Christian denominations, would allow female speakers as part of religious authority, something that would later go on to become a key part of the spiritualist movement. Also of note was the Quaker belief that there must be an unbroken chain of communication between the infinite and all beings. Because God's images resided within each individual, they believed any limitation on absolute freedom of conscience impeded the divine will. This would, in essence, give solid theological basis to the concept of communication from beyond, and would be part of the reason why communication with the dead, and thus their own divine essence of God, would become acceptable. As the author notes, this would go on to inform the reason why the Waterloo Friends would allow this practice to grow out of their Quaker heritage. It would appear that quite a large locus of interest in early spiritual communication would be one Leah Fox, older sister of the aforementioned Foxes, a woman plagued by headaches who would find relief in being placed into a trance-like state by the use of magnets, during which she would find she was able to communicate with spirits. After a year of communication, the spirits allegedly demanded a public demonstration of their intelligence. An assembled council claimed to be unable to detect fraud in this spirit communication. This is where we find our first major intersection of spiritualism with politics. Leah Fox, at one spirit communication, allegedly channeled the spirit of an anti-slavery pioneer whose daughter sat at the table, and during this seance allegedly rapped out with the use of an alphabet, "Spiritualism will work miracles in the cause of reform," and demonstrated its spiritual power by ringing a bell. These events will lead us to an interesting observation. That would be that many of the early spiritualists were reform and anti-slavery agitators. With the ability to prove communication from the great beyond, which was divine in nature, this would be the genesis of the political spiritualist movement, used by progressives of the day to legitimate their political beliefs with a phenomenon akin to divine right. It should be noted here, these early women would not end up partaking in the political movement that their early involvement would give rise to. They would merely serve to help codify the practices of spirit communication. Indeed, both Kate and Margaret Fox would fall into states of loneliness, poverty, and alcoholism, with Kate losing custody of her 2 sons, and Margaret blaming the spirits for her drunkenness. No pun intended. These 2 women would, however, convert many other influential people during their height to the cause of spiritualism. The chapter continues documenting the ongoing explosion of interest in spiritualism, and lands on an interesting observation on page 23, noting Americans would develop a taste of finding spirit messages most believable and plausible when the séance was held with an adolescent girl as the medium. Thus, spiritualism became closely identified with femininity. Indeed, Cora Wilburn, a popular spiritualist writer, heralded the advent of spirit communication, quote, in the persuasive accents of inspired woman's tongue, end quote. This may suggest something about humans in general, that they prefer to hear things that may be shocking, surprising, or depressing from a woman rather than a man. A certain strand of gynocentrism may have been at play here. However, this book notes there was also what would be at the time considered a scientific basis for this phenomenon. Spiritualism would often make use of scientific language related to flows of electricity and magnetism, such as positive and negative. These were popular terms in so-called sciences at the time, such as phrenology and mesmerism, not to mention newer technologies that would rise in the Industrial Revolution, such as electric lights. Males would be considered the positive energy, with females as a corresponding negative, an energy pattern found around the world in various religions and spiritual practices from the Far East, some of which were being slowly imported into the West at the time. Indeed, this belief would influence séance layouts, with many choosing to alternate male-female members and seat people based on strength of positive or negative energies. We should note here this is a custom and practice that still exists to this day, and the use of such positive-negative energy flows can be found in every aspect of New Ageism and its subgenres such as Wiccanism, both of which see predominantly female leadership and, often, the belief that women are inherently, by metaphysical nature, more spiritual than men, a belief that originates in 19th century spiritualism. The remainder of Chapter 1 attempts to quantify the total spread of spiritualism as a practice throughout the USA. However, this is preceded by a note that, owing to lack of formal organizations, estimates can vary wildly from a few 100,000 up to 11 million, in a total populace of 25 million. This is, however, qualified by the observation that enthusiastic supporters and alarmed detractors would propose numbers inflated or deflated in whatever direction they would so desire, without any factual basis. Oh, how some things never change. Chapter 2. Chapter 2, The Blessedness of Sinless Childhood in the Beyond World, was actually a basis for another talk I've given before, titled Abortion is Sacred. Because that video covers this chapter and references in other works we've talked about in the past in addition, thus expanding the total content, I shall simply place that talk here in this presentation. If you've already watched that talk, a timecode will be on screen to skip to for new content, and a progress bar will display throughout. Why is feminism, and the social justice movement more widely, including the various critical X studies, so obsessed with abortion? Like it is a sacred thing that must never be interrupted, and any questioning of abortion is just men trying to force women barefooted back into the baby mills and the sandwich mines. The answer is, unsurprisingly, theological in origin, given feminism's spiritual origins. To this end, do I believe that all the people crusading for abortion rights are doing so for religious reasons? No. They are the 99% who don't know what feminism is in its history, they haven't read their books or studies, they have only been told the revisionist view of history from their women's studies or gender studies professors, or they learned these things from people who have been educated as such, radiating out via social media. This may sound unfair to the neophytes of the faith, but I assure you I bring numerous receipts demonstrating the truth of this position in the form of a variety of academic books, many written by feminist scholars, and used as references in women's studies and gender studies courses at the university level. These will be referenced at the end of the video. There will also be links to other videos and live streams in which I go through or discuss these books in great depth. So, once again, I have the extensive evidence backing all of this up for people who simply do not want to believe this is true about feminism. Probably because it is a belief system they hold near and dear to their heart. I fully understand that observations of spiritualism in what you may consider to be a secular movement may seem ridiculous, but I encourage you not to hand-wave this and to approach it with honest, open inquiry. After all, if a movement is correct and has all of the answers, as feminism surely does, then such a movement and its adherents do not mind being questioned, so that they might be able to answer such inquiries and share their wisdom and correct knowledge on the topic. So why is abortion a sacred religious right to feminism? To understand this, we must go back to the religious origin of the feminist and women's rights movement. This would be the branch of Christianity known as Gnosticism, considered by some to be one of the Christian heresies. However, this does not make it not Christian. This Gnostic origin would radiate out into society via spiritual movements, such as spiritualism, Hermetica, Theosophy, and later on, New Ageism, and eventually merge into areas of Christianity, such as the Quakers, Transcendentalists, and Universalists. What is this origin point? Simply put, the origin can be found in the Gnostic concept of the world as a carceral construct created by a fallen god or angel to trap the souls of humanity away from God, the monad, the oversoul, Gaia, however you wish to phrase it in whatever modern incarnation this religion takes form. This leaves humanity in a position of being away from this central source, which is undesirable. As such, the onus falls to the human to acquire gnosis, acquire knowledge, break on through to the other side, and ascend or transcend to a higher plane of being. This can be done via understanding of the world and its true nature away from God, and the upping of vibrational frequency, something that is covered extensively in Helena Blavatsky's writing. She is the woman who created Theosophy, and is also covered in the Hermetic principle of vibration. This is why New Agers constantly talk about vibrations and upping their vibrational frequency. It is a means of transcendence. This is also the origin point of where you get the modern term vibe from, to have a vibe about something or to vibe with something. How and why is this tied to abortion? Going back a few centuries, there was a belief, partly from Calvinism, but can also be found in other Christian denominations, though many will in modern times attempt to deny this, that the unbaptized or non-Christian would go to hell for non-belief. This caused upset, especially to women who lost children during childbirth or shortly thereafter as infants who had not been baptized. There was somewhat a natural pushback to this in the form of spiritualism, which alleged that via mediums people could talk to the dead. Certain branches of Christianity picked up on this medium game and actually allowed it, suggesting that it was not in conflict with Christian dogma. This is because there are cases in certain translations of the Bible of people communicating with the dead, or with spirits, and in some cases even angels falling under this communication with something from beyond umbrella. This altered views of death and the afterlife in the cultural zeitgeist. Death was no longer the end, nor even a cut-off point. It was a rebirth, a call from God to come home, as defined by spiritualist Andrew Jackson Davis and others of his ilk. During this time, there was also an interesting shift in death rites in Europe and America concerning the conduct with the dead and burial. Cemeteries evolved into a more open plan and middle-class affair, reflecting the life of the increasingly suburban lifestyles of the up-and-coming. Larger plots for graves and mourners, more areas and graveyards for quiet sitting and contemplation. Death was no longer the end. This also combined with a fascinating change in temperament at the time, with people moving from village life to suburban and urban environs, which, ironically, despite more people being around, led to a greater sense of isolation. This moved mourning and death away from a village communal event to a private home sphere event. In other words, into the domain of the female. It is no coincidence that at this time, funeral rites and undertaking saw an explosion in consumerism regarding extravagancies of display of mourning, overtly elaborate flower displays, mourning gowns, increasingly elaborate caskets, etc. But that's another topic for another time. With this uptick of death becoming increasingly personal, combined with not being the end, combined with the notion that this world is a prison for the soul created by a deity or fallen angel to torment the souls of man, this combined with a few final elements, the first of which can be found in the writings of the likes of Marcuse concerning the nature of man. There are two fundamental views of man as related to nature and society. The first is that society and civilization have a civilizing effect on people. It takes the imperfect, sinful animal that is man and makes him better, bringing him closer to goodness, virtue, morality, and God, if you are so inclined to think that way. The counter to this, as is found in Marcuse and other Hegelian and later Marxist thinkers, is the opposite view, that this world is sinful and corrupting. It takes a fundamentally good and noble savage animal and corrupts it into something more sinful and evil. This is why several thinkers of these traditions advocate for such extreme social reform, to the point of outright destruction. This leads us to one of the key spiritualist beliefs, which falls into the latter of those two views of society. Most crucially, that the young, babies especially, are more free of sin than adults because they have not been exposed to the corrupting, sinful nature of society, a view which was popular with Puritans at the time, hence spiritualism rebelling against that tradition. As such, if a baby dies in the womb, at birth or shortly thereafter, well, of course that child is now in heaven with God, and thanks to spiritualist mediums, we have all sorts of proof and stories of how wonderful heaven is, how the children grow up there, guided by other relatives of their family who have also passed on. They learn to read and write. They tell you not to mourn them because they are happy in heaven with God and their relatives. In some cases, even living in their own beautiful houses, surrounded by flowing fields of gold. It is no coincidence that these spirit stories mirror a nostalgia-based harken back to the, at the time, idealized and romanticized rural lifestyle held by the middle class of the era, increasingly moving into more built-up areas. It is also no coincidence that with the spiritual belief of these proto-feminists replacing sin and death, they would also allow the unborn to look down upon their mothers with superhuman understanding, love, and forgiveness. In doing so, the spiritualist proto-feminist's now deceased child would replace Christ himself. This was the final step in the deification of the female and feminine. This was finalized with women being expected to be the spiritual center of the home, as they oversaw not only the death rites of their children, but also the birth of their children, the new Christ figures. The rejection of Calvinist views moving women away from being the fallen temptress of Eve leading men to sin, instead as the morally, spiritually pure, who would inculcate true piety into their children. In this new, holy, sacred, modern, liberal Christian home, the woman would also be expected to purify her husband from his terrible sins acquired while outside the home in the larger, corrupting, sinful world. In this new era of Christian home life, women became God, and her unborn or recently dead children became as Christ, filling her with superhuman forgiveness for her sins and loving her regardless from the new beyond after death. Look no further for proof of this than feminists' own writing. Schaef, 1982, in Women's Reality, literally describes how women are oppressed by their children, because their children provide purpose and moor them to the material world, the straight white male system world, full of social constructs created by men to prevent the rise of the theological female system, in which there is no objective reality. Everything is a living, ongoing process which, if unfettered by white male system oppressive influence, would allow that free-flowing exchange of energy and vibration from solar plexus to solar plexus, allowing women to fill their void of female sin, created by males to make them feel incomplete and inferior. And in filling their void of female sin, women could truly engage in process never-ending, to uncover the real her story of the world, up their vibrational frequencies, and transcend, to take back into themselves the essence of God, the Oversoul, Gaia, etc. Once again, I remind you I am quoting here from a women's studies text that is used at the university level and can be found as required reading on women's studies and gender studies courses. If you take all these points together, you realize the true spiritual origins of abortion and how it has shaped the feminist rhetoric of the day. Abortion is a religious act, freeing women of material connection, turning their children from their born oppressor into their unborn savior, while the mothers themselves become the savior of the unborn child, protecting it from the pseudo-hell that is the carceral construct of this material plane of existence, taking that pure unborn soul and allowing it to escape corruption and transcend directly to heaven. If you wanted to go even further into esoteric occultism, there are branches of spiritualism that combine esoteric Christianity and Jewish Kabbalah that would indicate the Levantine god Yahweh as being the demiurge that created this world, and Yahweh sharing roots with the Canaanite god Moloch, whose name roots from the Punic language Moloch meaning sacrifice. Through slightly convoluted means, this could, hypothetically, if you really wanted to reach, indicate that abortion, the killing of children, could be a dedication to this god associated with child sacrifice. That last part is presented tongue-in-cheek. I don't actually think that you would be able to pin the broader feminist movement to the position that they push abortion as a means of feeding baby souls to Moloch. Nor do I actually believe that many could be pinned to abortion being a means of saving children from incarceration on Earth as a means of transcending their souls to God in a sacrificial act that simultaneously saves the soul of the woman getting the abortion via their infant's own superhuman love, forgiveness, and happiness in the next world. The only reason I think modern feminists cannot be pinned to these positions is because, as I indicated at the beginning, 99% of them are neophytes of the faith, who have not read their own movement's literature, nor read the history of the movement, or where their ideas came from. They have just been indoctrinated with slogans like, "If you are not a feminist, you are a sexist," backed up with such reasoning as, "Feminism is when good things," which is coincidentally similar reasoning used by others in the Hegelian spiritualist tradition, such as Marxists and socialists. But proof that such people are not materialists as they claim to be is another topic for another time. If you would like more information on this topic of abortion as sacrosanct, and how and why I have uncovered this position, I recommend to you as a starting point the books Women's Reality by Ann Wilson Schaef, Radical Spirits by Ann Braude, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition by Glenn McGee, Science, Politics, and Gnosticism by Eric Vogelin, and The Secret Doctrine by Helena Blavatsky. If that last one is a little heavy, you could substitute The Feminine Occult, which is a collection of 18 essays from Helena Blavatsky, Annie Besant, Florence Farr, and others, detailing their views on spiritualism, mysticism, Kabbalah, Hermetica, Theosophy, etc. All the things that kick-started the feminist religion. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 introduces us to the ongoing political agitation that spawned from this empathic female-led individualism that grew out of the spiritualist movement. Interestingly, from page 56 is a quote from medium Elizabeth Kingsbury in 1857, who declared, quote, "Equal rights is my motto," end quote, but stated she found that, quote, "woman has been so long subject to customs degrading to herself that neither she nor the men are sensible where and to what extent they exist," end quote. This was in reference to equal rights. I find this phrase most fascinating, Were it not for its grammatical structure and vocabulary, this slogan's sentiment in 1857 would be right at home in any modern feminist political agitation rally. Consider it the 170-year-old version of "women were literally chattel" and "women have been oppressed for all of human history." It goes to show that any agitator for the rights of women is always the one good, intelligent, educated person who is on the right side of history regardless of time period, and everyone else, especially all the people back then, were always poor, stupid, unenlightened Luddites by comparison. The meme of the current day argument is well over a century and a half old. Later on the same page is another thing of note. Quote, "Spiritualists' commitment to the emancipation of women formed one plank of a broad reform platform designed to overthrow conventions imposed by church or state between the individual and his or her God-given nature." End quote. The main reason this is of note is thinking back to Schaef 1981 and her assertions of the male system and how it creates orders such as religion, but also science and modes of understanding so as to oppress women and their female system thinking, which is a theological system with transcendental undertones connecting the female system process to God, the oversoul, Gaia, etc. Any created system outside of the seemingly inherent to female nature female system is bad and must be overthrown. As it turns out, Schaef, in her women's studies book that is used at the university level, is using the same rhetoric as spiritualist emancipation campaigners from over a century before. The next few pages documents the Seneca Falls Convention and the attendance of numerous spiritualists and mediums, as well as the presence of allegedly supernatural rapping sounds. Important things to note is the presence and overrepresentation of slavery abolitionists and Quakers. This mixing and matching seems to have irreversibly connected these things into a general progressive milieu. As Braude notes, quote, "Spiritualist rhetoric gave gender roles the same urgency that others saw in winning freedom for the slave." End quote. The next part of this chapter gives us a lengthy and well-sourced rundown of a variety of other conventions and its attendees, meticulously noting, where possible, religious inclinations, once again continuing to demonstrate the overrepresentation of spiritualists and Quakers until we land at the Rutland Free Convention, with its strong spiritualist leanings and many calls for emancipation, anti-authoritarianism, and radical individualism. Of most note was not the strong statements on women's rights given by spiritualist speakers regarding women's right to decide when and under what circumstances to bear children, but instead the words of medium Julia Branch, who gave a fiery defense of the concept of free love, and stated, quote, "that the slavery and degradation of woman proceeded from the institution of marriage, that by the marriage contract she loses control of her name, her person, her property, her labor, her affections, her children, and her freedom." End quote. This resolution would preoccupy the rest of the convention, and became responsible for its reputation as a meeting of free lovers. It should be noted that despite its vigorous discussion, this proposal was voted down. It should also be noted at this convention the resolution that spiritualism and radical reform expressed complementary aspects of the single goal of human progress. This can be best seen by several spiritualist speakers choosing not to use their time to address their religion of choice, but instead to speak on the topic of reform issues, including women's rights and free trade. There was a distinct disagreement at this convention between those who would choose to divide and those who would marry spiritualism with the reform agendas of the day. After a few pages listing out the names and delineating particular sides, it should be noted that things would basically shake out to spiritualism ending up as a reforming anti-slavery movement, with only one pro-slavery spiritualist paper. This would mark a distinct beginning point for spiritualism as a political force, with majority support for abolition, women's rights, and free love, with some few detractors. This chapter continues documenting various factions within this proto-feminist spiritualist movement, and their varying degrees of support of reform, abolition, etc. On page 78 there comes something of note, mostly because of the rhetoric used. That is, although spiritualists would universally condemn slavery, there came a certain stripe of the movement that would assert that white women, not black men, suffered the worst slavery, with observations such as from medium Warren Chase, who stated, quote, "The slavery of women was deeper and most lasting than that of the Negroes in the hearts and prejudices of the people." Frederick Douglass would implore that this time of history be the Negro's hour, while Juliet Stillman, quote, "told plainer than words that now is woman's hour, and she has but to work and wait for the harvest that is ripening, that she can gather herself and her daughters the rich fruits of freedom, equality, and justice." End quote. This is all quite of interest concerning modern rhetoric around feminism and its modern intersectional memes, and the butting of heads concerning so-called white feminism. It is interesting how, seemingly, all talks around oppressions always seem to roll back to "women have it worst," regardless of era. The chapter continues in documenting yet more conventions and its spiritualist attendees, and how they would frequently make campaigns for women's rights and social reform, before noting in its closing page the relative absence of spiritualists from standard chronicles of the time, resulting in the canonizing of the history of the women's rights movement in the 3-volume History and Woman and Suffrage, edited by Elizabeth Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Joslin. This is furthered by the observation that this leaving out of spiritualism may or may not have been by intention, but did note that there certainly seemed to be some interest in removing this religion from the movement's canon because of its heterodox nature. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 reveals to us the influence women had in this new religion of spiritualism, noting that as reformers would talk about the importance of women's autonomy in society, mediums would place women front and centre as the central figures in this Reformation's new religion, allowing women to access a social role occupied almost exclusively by males in the mostly Christian branches at the time, yet, by dint of spiritualism's structure, allowed women to also remain within various social norms and expectations of femininity of the era, what Braude refers to as the cult of true womanhood. The cult of true womanhood asserted that women's nature was characterized by purity, piety, passivity, and domesticity. This would make women particularly adept and suited to religion, and made religion very important to women, but with the expectation that this would be subordinate to male authority in religious matters. Spiritualism fully embraced this pious, pure female nature rhetoric, and combined it with the simple logic that if women's nature made them more suited to religion, then of course they would be more spiritually attuned and aware than men. On page 83, I have also noted a curious detail regarding female physicality and religion. As one spiritualist leader wrote, quote, "Women in the 19th century are physically sick, weak, and declining," end quote, but would also note, quote, "The functions depending on force and muscle are weak. The nerves are intensely sensitive. Hence sickness, rest, passivity, susceptibility, impressionability, mediumship, communication, revelation," end quote. All these character traits that would render women incapable of the male role would now make them ideal for the spiritual, without allowing people to question the accepted ideas of woman's nature. My note to this section is regarding other spiritual practices, frequently found in various folk religions and types of shamanism, the stereotype of the wounded healer as Jung would eventually refer to it. The notion that for people to become in some way spiritually attuned to the universe, it is of great help for that person to be struck by physical or mental infirmity that they would usually heal themselves of, frequently without the use of accepted medical devices, medication, or standards, and thus take a place as an important spiritual fixture within their society. This also ties into concepts such as shaman sickness, the idea that an illness is a call to greater spiritualism, and will only abate when one walks the path rather than denying this spirit call. Interestingly, this, from a socio-evolutionary perspective, may have simply evolved as a means of ensuring that chronically ill or physically or mentally disabled people could still perform some valued function within a society. It's just very interesting to note that this is something that came along for the ride with spiritualist practices, and gave a specific inroad for women to reach greater spiritual heights. This is especially since this book is concerned with the US, which has its own indigenous folk and shamanic practices, although how much these things line up as a result of that crossing over is purely speculation on my part. However, it's an interesting thing to note, even if not directly causally related. It would still show an interesting sign of convergent evolution in religious practice. This is doubly of note because, as Braude goes on to note, women allegedly did not choose mediumship. Rather, they were chosen by spirits for the role. This would make sense because of their uniquely female nature. This would in turn make becoming a medium not an active role chosen, but a passive role fulfilled. Hence, one does not become a medium, one is instead developed as a medium. This, crucially, as Braude notes, allowed mediumship to not be seen as a rebellion against female roles in society. This is a fascinating observation as it ties back to topics we've mentioned before, regarding women's desire to be seen as active in society versus their willingness to exercise power by proxy. This came up extensively during our look at Schaef 1981. The observation that women would accept men doing things for them because it would limit public blowback if the idea or task failed. This reinforces observations of an interesting difference that seems to exist between men and women. Men, on aggregate, being more willing to face the possibility of failure and social censure and/or derision for their ideas or failures. Women being more likely to seek to push their own ideas through men around them as a form of insulation or protection. This, of course, limited negative feedback to the woman, but does have the downside of limiting recognition of female involvement. A double-edged sword indeed, only one side of which modern gender activists seem to wish to grind. This reliance on female gender roles and female nature formed a perfect synthesis to allow women to climb high in importance in the spiritualist caste system, and also served as an excellent means of keeping men out of that system, by dint of their very inherited nature being unsuitable for the task. Such was the high thought of women chosen for this calling, that Amanda Spence, addressing a spiritualist meeting, said it should be, quote, rejoiced that spiritualism had called out woman, end quote, for the, quote, duties and trials in which none but angels could sympathize, end quote. This is all most important when considering notes on page 85, in which Braude mentions the differences in how men and women would address spiritualist conventions. Men would stand conscious on stage, addressing the room as themselves, their own ideas, thoughts, and reasoning on display. Women, however, would take to the stage unconscious, in a deep trance state, speaking only whatever the spirits would tell them to say. Consider once more what we observed earlier about risk tolerance differences between the sexes. This strategy makes a lot of sense. Men could be ridiculed or proven wrong themselves for saying things that were objectionable. Women, however, if proven wrong, and presenting objectionable ideas, could face no such censure. After all, those words were not her own. The other thing of note regarding this was spiritualism and mediumship more widely allowing a greater and easier access to the profession. Women, in contrast to men, could now become religious leaders and teachers without education, and based entirely on invisible, unprovable, not truly measurable spiritual purity and piety alone. Indeed, trance speaker Lizzie Dutton stated, quote, woman does not need to cultivate her intellect in order to perceive spiritual truths. Let her live only true to her divine nature and her spiritual perceptions. As noted earlier from the section on Chapter 2, you can see here the women becoming as God part of this religion. This is made all the more troubling because, as noted, women do not need to possess any knowledge, training, education, or understanding of anything in order to fulfill this most important of roles within their own religion. When entering a trance, her word becomes law. The next several pages go on to detail various trance and mediumship speakers and their attendees, giving ample evidence as to this practice and its spread and frequency. As a particular example of the popularity of this women as spiritually superior motif, a quote on page 94 suffices from one Parker Willis, who was notably skeptical of spiritualism and mediumship and yet said of the medium Cora Hatch. But my instinctive feeling, I must own, made no objection to the propriety of the performance. The tone and manner were of absolute sincerity, of devoutness, which compelled respect, and before she closed I was prepared to believe her an exception, either that a male spirit was speaking through her lips, or that the relative position of the sexes is not the same as in the days of St. Paul. How was it with the Corinthians? Women are certainly better than we in these latter days, and as standing far nearer God, may properly speak for us, even in holy places, or so it seemed to me while listening to Mrs. Hatch. The remainder of Chapter 4 details the life of Aksha Sprague, and her life and career as a medium, and several of the people and places she saw and impacts she had. This is an interesting short biography, but not something I feel need to talk about in any particular depth here. It is certainly worth a read, though. Chapter 5. Chapter 5 introduces us to the all-important topic of marriage, with an introduction to Mary Fenn Love, a divorcee who would, at a women's rights conference in 1853, attribute, quote, the chief evils of society to domestic uncongeniality, end quote. Mary Fenn Love would later go on to marry one Andrew Jackson Davis. Thinking back to our last book, Occult Feminism, I'm heavily reminded how many of these proto-feminists and women's rights activists always seem to come from broken marriages and families. The now Mary Davis would continue to advocate that marriage was a leading cause of social problems in society. Many spiritualists would come to agree with this position, not because they opposed the existence of marriage, but instead condemned the conditions imposed on such unions, making women subservient to men. The individualism that powered the spiritual activists in other areas of politics would now become focused on the institution of marriage, criticizing the relations between husbands and wives, the choice of marriage partners, the relations between parents and children. I have a particularly strong highlight for that given recent progressive agitations, and the nature and amount of sexual intercourse, both inside and outside marriage. These same individualist critiques would now be used to question any and all social orders that would place one person in a position of authority over another. During a period that would put marriage as an institution on a pedestal and frequently outright ban the discussions of sex and sexuality in public, and frequently private as well, spiritualists would enjoy the passive protections that their trade would allow, and used this to insist on frank and open analysis of the personal, political, and economics of all relationships, including sexual relationships. This critique of marriage would go on to become a central plank in the spiritualist women's rights platform. With a history of abolition of slavery at the corner of the spiritualist cause, it is only natural that those who would advocate for personal sovereignty of women would now make use of anti-slavery rhetoric to attack marriage as an institution. Given this was an era when default custody of children would fall to the father, as he would be legally enforced to provide financially and materially for any children he might sire with his wife, and also enjoy full legal responsibility in the event of anything negative happening to said children as well. It would only correctly follow that individualist spiritualist advocates would claim that marriage, quote, robbed the wife of her child, her property, of her name, and of her individuality, end quote. Worst and most damning of all was the claim that married women shared a specific disability with those legally enslaved. Once married, a woman would lack any legal right to control their bodies, with mediums spreading ideas such as, quote, rape is punished outside of wedlock, but in it paid no attention to, end quote. This was in the context of women being disallowed to deny sexual advances from their husbands. I do have some notes to this because this is something that could contextually be considered true, but lacks much needed nuances and clarifications. These are, of course, given in general terms, and your mileage for these observations may vary depending on your nation and historic time period. Historically speaking, within marriage, there was reasonable assumption that a marriage would be consummated and produce children. To this end, there were various legal provisions that would affect both sexes, and make allowances for unwilling or unable partners. It is not uncommon to find historical cases of both men and women making claims that their marriages were unconsummated as grounds for divorce, and frigidity on part of either partner could very frequently cause social and legal trouble. For but one amusing but also slightly horrifying example, in the Middle Ages in Europe, the allegation of a wife claiming her husband was unable to perform his marital duties in bed would result in her husband being hauled before a council of knowledgeable women, aka usually older women who had had multiple children and probably also grandchildren, and he would, under their oversight, be expected to remove his trousers in front of them and achieve an erection under their scrutiny. Should he be unable to get an erection, on demand, in front of a crowd of random strangers staring intently at him in harsh judgment, this would be deemed more than enough grounds for that woman to divorce her husband immediately, and have it be widely known by all that he, her now former husband, lacked virility, and may well be sterile on top of that, or, even worse, perhaps even secretly a homosexual, thus effectively ending any potential to find another suitor in his town. Legal facts such as these are not always widely spoken of, and when they are, it will almost certainly only be in relation to provisions placing standards on women and their expected role within a marriage when it comes to sex and reproduction. So while I don't doubt that there may have been social and perhaps even legal expectations placed on married women with regards to sex and reproduction in this era, I would implore you to fully investigate such standards and observe how many there are on men as well. This does not attempt to excuse or justify any such standards, it is merely to highlight that they existed, and the historical revision of many modern feminist activists does not change this fact. Indeed, when it comes to the topic of marital rape and its legality, I have historically addressed this, and, once again nation-dependent, it was never legally permissible for a man to force sex upon his unwilling wife. The crime may not specifically be called rape in the law of the time, but battery, sexual battery, and assault were all crimes that could be applied to such a scenario. Indeed, I recall in a video discussing Old English law concerning, quote, the carnal knowledge of a woman without her consent, end quote, there were not only strict punishments for the man himself, but even legal provisions for the castration and tail docking of any livestock he may own. Not only a very public sign of shame for his crime, but also life-destroying, because he now has no fertile animals to breed for income or survival. Returning to the book, it is important to note here on page 119 the use of what would later become fairly standard mainstay rhetoric of New Age religions that we discussed in our previous book's videos. Braude notes that spiritualists would hold to the belief that marriage should be raised to a higher plane of morality, so that it would be, quote, a soul union, not a curse, end quote. Spiritualists would propose egalitarian marriages based on equal trust and spiritual attraction, as opposed to the more common marriages for reasons of other things, such as economic or social benefit. As was said at the time, quote, there is no real marriage, but the marriage of affection, end quote. Indeed, the Plain Guide to Spiritualism proclaimed, quote, all marriage and all sexual cohabitings as false and infernal, unless they are based on spiritual affections and are under the purer influence of celestial harmony, end quote. Returning to the Fourierist theory of passional attraction, some spiritualists would advance doctrines of spiritual affinity, that there is a natural order to things and that within that natural order of things there is someone for everyone, a true spiritual partner for every person in the world, and that if they did not meet them on this earth, they would certainly do so in the next world, or heaven. Yes, the romantic concept of the One is spiritualist in origin and tied to the proto-feminist movement. This is just another example of how deeply ingrained this belief system is in nigh every corner of modern society and thought. This would go even further and tie with the concept of female spiritual superiority over the male, with Henry Wright stating that he found, quote, no man can be what he was designed to be till by marriage the spirit of a woman has entered into him to refine, beautify, and strengthen his particular nature and assimilate it to the divine, end quote. Once again, here we see the creeping tendrils of the female divine entering the parlance of the era. He would make similar proclamations of men for women, but noted crucially in an article, God as a woman, just as Jesus served as saviour for woman, so woman provided saviour for man. Some spiritualists would, despite their frequent flirting with and brushing up against the concept of free love, attempt to make definition between what they would term true affection and sensual attraction. Quote, to be carnally minded is death, end quote, would warn trance speaker Laura Cuppy. There would be arguments that true marriages could result only from spiritual attraction. Henry Wright at an engagement introduced a resolution committing, quote, to avoid all customs, habits and practices that tend to develop and strengthen the animal appetites and passions at the expense of the higher, more spiritual elements of our nature, end quote. Medium Charlotte Beebe Wilbur would speak on the topic stating, quote, all the passions are in the ideal conception good and noble, and only become vices when they become warped and contorted by the inadequacy of the corporeal medium through which they attempt to realize themselves in acts, end quote. Here we see more transcendental dualist rhetoric, the likes of which we've mentioned before. This spiritual angle and ideal of individualist love, and the highest and most pure form of relationship and marriage, would strike not only to the social core of marriages, of which arranged marriages were still a part, but also at the concept of the Christian church marriage that was the norm at the time. On page 120 I have a note for a sentence that I found highly amusing, because this book was first published in 1989 and is written about people talking in the late 1800s. That amusing sentence is the first of the paragraph in the subsection Marrying for Money. It states as follows, quote, medium Lizzie Dotton asserted that fewer women would marry if they had wages equal to men's, and therefore had the option of supporting themselves, end quote. This paragraph continues to expand on this thought, but I have to immediately comment here that, given recent years, this observation is 100% true. As the decades have gone by and more women have entered the workforce, with young single women now out-earning young single men in several professions, and preferable DEI-based hiring practices aimed at hiring and advancing women over men, we see record low rates of marriages, and even the total collapse of the dating market. It's interesting that it was known that this would happen over a century ago, and yet in this modern era, we still have people who will deny that such a pattern of behavior is happening, or if it is, then it's a good thing, because who needs long-term relationships and family formation when you can have increasing rates of mental health problems, a loneliness epidemic, and general social misery? The following few paragraphs of the book detail various attempts to equalize the workforce, and continues to expound upon the spiritualists' and proto-feminists' demands and calls for more equitable workforces, and observations regarding how a marriage for reasons of financial gain could never truly be a loving relationship. Indeed, activists of the era seemed to consider marriage as merely a form of slavery or prostitution. My notes to this concerning the era in question are mostly with regards to the effects of the Industrial Revolution. Calls for industry owners to hire women instead of men seem to have come about because of the destruction of home industry caused by the Industrial Revolution. Professions that are labour-intensive and skilled, such as sewing, weaving, spinning, textile manufacture, etc., usually a core part of the home industry and thus done mostly by women, historically speaking, these tasks could be automated and outsourced to larger industrial machines that would produce goods faster and without break than any home industrialist could hope to match. Once again, we seem to rub up against a point I have raised before over the years. Modern gender activists may choose to blame and hate men, claiming that this robbing women of their jobs was a means of enslaving women and turning them into nothing but sandwich-making baby factories by removing any independence a money-making home job might produce for them. However, what I think we see here is actually a personification of male love for the women in their lives, and women more broadly. Men seeking to free women from any and all labour and duty because of love for them, and wanting women to have a life of ease and comfort, while the men shoulder danger and risk for themselves. This is a pattern of behaviour born of love, not hate. However, at this point I do feel compelled to point out the necessity of suffering and struggle as a means of improvement, and actually finding happiness and satisfaction in things that are difficult. The more I find myself observing this pattern through time, the more I find myself overwhelmed by the sense that men care for and love women too much, to the point where attempting to save and protect women from any and all hardship, something that throughout most of history would be necessary because of the subsistence standard of living, in a time of such peace and plenty, may lead to attempting to even go so far as to attempt to spare women the burden of having to do the most basic of tasks of self-development and improvement that they require to become fully functioning, realized and responsible adults, able to take responsibility for their own actions, which is increasingly difficult for modern women, it seems. And women being able to take joy in the necessary struggle, suffering, and hard work of life. Indeed, it seems women are so used to being protected from any sort of work that they now call even having to listen to men talk about the hardship they face as being emotional labor, and that they must now be spared even having to listen to something they don't like. Men, of course, actually seem to support this, and want for women to not even have to do that, because men love women, and they love them so much it's unreal. This is of course just my opinion on the subject, but going through more and more history over time, this pattern seems to be consistently true, and yet also consistently denied. Having previously mentioned prostitution, it's interesting to note that prostitutes were, of course, on the mind of the spiritual activists of the day, who would, in later centuries, become our modern feminist movement. Lizzie Dotton believed that prostitution reform was meaningless without commiserate economic opportunity. As Braude notes on page 123, mediums seem to identify with prostitutes because of perceived parallels in the nature and conditions of their work, specifically relinquishing the use and control of their own body for pay. Fascinatingly, mediumship seemed to become a focus of a #MeToo style campaign, with observations that unconscious women in the seance room were vulnerable to unscrupulous men. Indeed, medium Matty Hull remarked, quote, "Fully 2/3 of those who go to mediums go with direct intention of being alone with a lady and offering an insult. Others, by their very first question, show that they are in spiritualism for the loaves and the fishes, in other words, to prostitute it to mercenary purposes." As such, mediumship and seances began drawing some manner of tie between themselves and sex work. This of course led to accusations of male exploitation, not only sexually, but also financially, with claims men would attempt to control mediums under their power in order to turn a profit by selling the lady's spiritual services, rendering her little more than a spiritual prostitute. Many such statements and examples follow in this book, but these are clarifications and demonstrations of the point, and do not need to be covered here. The pages about spiritualists' opinions on prostitution inevitably give way to the section about pregnancy and motherhood. Unsurprisingly, spiritualists of the era maintained a position of, quote, "The most sacred and important right of women is her right to decide for herself how often and under what circumstances she shall assume the responsibilities and be subjected to the cares of maternity." Of quick note here, I find the mention of the important concept of responsibilities when concerning women to be refreshing, since it is basically 100% absent from modern feminist slogans and rhetoric. However, even back in this day, we find much of the blame for pregnancy firmly squared on the shoulders of men. Braude notes on page 126, quote, "Spiritualists blamed men for enforced motherhood, with its concomitant liabilities," end quote. Mrs. S. H. Walls, in the spiritualist paper Banner of Light, even stated, quote, "There is no joy on earth compared to that of a willing mother, and no sorrow to that of an unwilling one. And what but men's animal passions ever make unwilling ones?" I find this question to be odd and amusing, because it is literally the same rhetoric used in modern times, often mocked under the name of the knock-up fairy. Women just get pregnant somehow, and it's definitely men doing it too. She didn't choose to have unprotected sex with a stranger in the car park of a bar. She just stepped outside one day and slipped in a puddle of pregnancy, and whoops, there's a baby now. Some things never truly change, and the idea of women taking any responsibility seemed contentious even a century ago. Of note, however, declining birth rates of the era suggest spiritualist rhetoric around this topic was a popular sentiment. Interestingly, the decline in birth rates coincided with an ideological elevation of motherhood. As childbirth became less common and routine, the idea that having a baby was some sacred act became more and more prevalent in society. I would also add to this, although this may be my own conjecture, that a movement away from rural life for large parts of the population may have helped spur this shift in perception. After all, seeing births on a regular basis, either in village life or even amongst livestock animals, has an effect of making it seem routine to the point of mundanity. However, moving away from such environs to a larger, more populous, and paradoxically more socially isolated city life would remove this normal everyday view of pregnancy and birth, helping to spur on the idea that it was some incredibly rare and thus important and perhaps metaphysically involved process. As the book notes, this right to voluntarily decide motherhood reached a point of cross-group interests. Radicals, suffragists, and conservative temperance and social purity advocates all came to agree that women should control their own fertility. A natural follow-on topic that is covered next from page 127 is the concept of free love, a term that Braude notes has become somewhat distorted by our 20th century understanding of it. While the 1960s may have given rise to an increasing idea of free love being about hedonistic, short-term multiple-partner pleasure-seeking, in spiritualist terms, and as Braude notes, most spiritualists did not support free love, but most free love advocates were spiritualists, in the 1800s the term free love meant something radically different, and came with not only support for monogamous unions, and in many cases marriage, but it was the nature of marriage and partner choice to which free love referred, that the morality of sexual intercourse should depend on the free experiencing of compelling mutual desire, that is, love, not on social and economic arrangements such as marriage. As a highlight for the controversial use of the term free love, even in its time, trance speaker Lizzie Dutton stated, quote, "There are two meanings of free love, one high and holy, another low, debased, meaning free lust." Most interestingly in this regard, she would attribute this free lust interpretation to be the fault of male spiritualists, and their attempting to turn to spiritualism, to use a modern phrase, just to get laid. The section of this chapter dealing with sex radicalism is most enlightening, as it highlights positions that would, in later decades, go on to become a mainstay of many modern feminist activists. This would, specifically, be the writings of Lois Weisbrooker. As is typical of many proto-feminists of the era, she was a product of divorce and/or failed relationships. She would, in her publications, The Sexual Question and the Money Power, and the account of the feminist utopia, A Sex Revolution, go on to relate how she considered women to be victims of every aspect of modern morality, decrying women being held to differing standards to men, and the supposed economic slavery of marriage. She believed women's emancipation required the restraint of men's passion and the release of female sexual impulses. Curiously, she seemed to believe that natural human impulses, including sexual, revealed part of the divine order of creation, claiming that desire was natural and thus good. Weisbrooker's claims that human sexuality must be fully accepted and embraced in order to allow for full self-respect of every person shows the distance that spiritualism has travelled from the religious views that first inspired the movement. Indeed, in her book, The Occult Power of Sex, she would claim that the power of magnetism not only allowed for spiritual communication, but also powered the sex drive that would draw men and women together. She held that this force could either be satisfied by the yearnings of youth and sex, or by religion, and that religious leaders would attempt to control people's sex and sexuality because of that fact. Chapter 6. As a suitable follow-on, Chapter 6, Mediums versus the Medical Men, deals with spiritualists' impacts on the politics of women's health. Braude notes that at the time women's health, and health in general, were frequently misunderstood. Spiritualists would join reformers focusing on health and self-sovereignty. This would include what one ate, what one wore, the treatment one would receive while sick, etc. At the time, there was a cultural disagreement about women and their overall health, with some proponents suggesting women were more inclined to weakness and sickness. This is of course a half-truth, given basic biological differences between men and women concerning such things as average muscle mass and body fat percentages, which are influenced by naturally occurring and genetically informed hormone releases, with mandatory disclaimers for environmental alteration to these things, because some people cannot ever not mention this, even when it's demonstrably true that genetics plays a crucial role, almost as if they desire to hint or gently push the long since debunked tabula rasa. Spiritualists would rejoin this conversation by noting women are naturally healthy, and that women's debilitation was caused by unwilling and loveless marriage, repeated unwanted pregnancy, restrictive clothing, poor diet, and lack of exercise. As Braude notes, these two poles of opinion had roots in divergent views of nature that tied to sectarian healing, heterodox religion, and regular medicine to Protestant orthodoxy, with sectarians looking to nature as an ally in the healing process, regulars viewing nature as presenting problems that must be controlled. Orthodoxy holds to the philosophy of man in the state of nature as being flawed from birth, and in need of the civilizing effects and help of society or commonwealth. This would carry over into the world of health, where the human body was inherently prone to disease and illness. Spiritualists would attack this orthodoxy using many of the same arguments they used elsewhere. Humans embody the image of God and natural law. Health, much like their divinity, was part of human nature, and would come to people naturally without the constraints and oppressions of society. Similar to the insistence individuals had direct access to the divine truth without the need for scripture or clergy, so too did humans have access to health and well-being by the same logic. This would of course lead to the position that women, being naturally more spiritually attuned than men, would also make superior healers to men, because of their ability to commune better with spirits and thus diagnose maladies of the spirit or body. In much the same way a spiritualist or medium would mend the rift between the living and the dead, so too could they fix rents betwixt body and soul. This would have the impact of turning medicine away from men with training and towards women with vision. If this sounds familiar to you, it should. See the non-stop parade of Instagram-tier crystal hippie chicks and their new age woo about vibrations, a topic we have covered before, as relating to the Hermetic principle of vibration. This is a direct outgrowth of this spiritualist practice. Following this is an observation from Braude concerning changes to the medical landscape of the time. With the growth of the Industrial Revolution and new technologies that it would give rise to, the notion of human control over nature increased exponentially. This had a somewhat knock-on effect in the medical world which, relative to the progress around it, remained somewhat stagnant by comparison. Orthodox healers would still rely on things like bleeds, purges, narcotics, alcohol, and doses of toxic mercury and opium. By contrast, a great challenge arose in the form of what would now be called alternative medicines, homeopaths prescribing much more pleasant medicines in infinitesimal doses, provided a much more tolerable, and even if ineffective, certainly not harmful alternative to orthodox medicine. For people such as the book's aforementioned Aksha Sprague, with lifelong problems, exhausting the ineffective physical therapies of the era, left only the possibility of spiritual cure to ease their physical woes. This would lead mediums and trance speakers to prescribe various remedies and treatments handed to them by their supposed spirit doctors. Spiritualists would also turn to mesmerism and attribute physical healing powers to trance states, electricity, and magnetism. Indeed, a cottage industry of medium-based medicine opened up prescribing all manner of pseudoscientific cures to anything that ails a person. There are several examples of this on pages 146 through 148. Owing to this difference in approach and dividing public opinions, it would come as no surprise that animosity would arise between healing mediums and physicians. This was detailed in the biography of Mrs. J. H. Conant, medium of the Banner of Light. The biography details a near-fatal dose of morphine prescribed by a physician who was himself under the influence. Fortunately, the dosage was not fatal, and Mrs. Conant, under influence of a trance state, prescribed for herself a treatment that would prove successful. Medical mediums were predominantly female. This came about because of previously mentioned presuppositions that were brought about by the spiritualist movement. The naturally more pure and pious female nature combined with the known fact of women's inherently more caring and nurturing qualities. Note here that in recent years, we have seen this come under attack from feminists as a patriarchal oppressive construct, the notion of women as naturally better caregivers. Yet here we reveal the truth, that this is a stereotype that was created by the proto-feminist movement itself a century before. There is something amusing about feminists attacking other feminists while blaming everything but feminism for this conflict. Indeed, I would point out this went so far with evidence of Miranda Randall and her receipt of an MD in 1855. She viewed women as especially suited to medical practice because women experience a social system that forced women into marriage and gave them health problems unique to having their rights over their own bodies stripped from them. In Randall's view, women also needed medical care more than men because women suffered more harshly from the ills of society. Were it not known that these positions and statements were from the 1850s, you could be mistaken for thinking that these statements were made last week at a women's rights rally around the topic of some healthcare issue or another, such as abortion. As Braude goes on to note, spiritualists viewed the training of women in medicine to be of paramount importance, and this support would cross political lines, resulting in support of both sectarian and orthodox females in medical training. Here I would like to make an expansion to this and note that this is something that seems to have never changed. As Williams 2023 indicates, there is no sisterhood when it comes to women and their interactions with each other. However, there is still strong in-group bias on the part of women, in the abstract at the very least. This can result in women from radically different political stripes still siding with each other because of shared female identity. Indeed, the concept of the importance of the category of simply being female seems to hold throughout basically all of human history. See any rhetoric used by even extremist groups, and it is always broadly either pro-female or at the very least female-neutral, while always being anti-male. You can see this in the lynching cultures of, say, the southern US and the KKK. The target was, first and foremost, men. Yes, these groups would lynch white men, and historically did in larger numbers, if they were accused of crimes against women, even black women. This is because while race was an issue for them, sex was a far bigger issue. Even modern so-called race issues, such as the colloquialism driving while black, is actually driving while black and male, with the most crucial part of that sentence being driving while male. When asking people who make the driving while black suggestion something along the lines of, would that happen to your black mother, sister, or daughter, the answer is very frequently, after some thought, no, thus revealing the gendered bias of the situation. This can even be borne out in statistics. People who would make the institutional racism argument while citing a difference between black and white incarceration rates will always ignore the difference in sex sentencing between men and women, which is around 6 times larger. If race is an issue in any of these contexts, sex is a much bigger issue. Although it should also be noted on the angle of race difference, when controlling for IQ and criminal history, the race gap narrows to the point of vanishing. This is true today, and it would appear to be the case throughout history as well. After all, despite popular belief, feminism did not invent the idea that men should care about women in the 1960s. That was always true. This movement merely glommed onto something that was already the case, as we can see going back through books such as these. The section on health reform continues, noting that spiritualists came to champion all manner of social reforms aimed at freeing women from socially constructed restrictions on their bodies and movement. This included changing to clothing standards, advocacy for exercise, gymnastics, temperance, vegetarianism, and water cure, which is effectively an early form of hydrotherapy. Interestingly, especially with regard to the previous mentioned section, these reforms were only advocated for women. Indeed, Andrew Jackson Davis claimed in the Herald of Progress, quote, "Dress reform will eradicate the worst slavery of American women," end quote. As Braude notes, dress reform applied only to women, with no attempt being made to alter the standard of male costume. Louise Whittier, in The Banner of Light, insisted that physical reform must accompany spiritual emancipation. Thus, this plank in the spiritualist women's rights platform came to represent much larger concerns than mere physical freedom. Interestingly, this health reform attitude also frequently included a strain of spiritualism opposed to the consumption of alcohol and tobacco. Although many spiritualists and mediums objected to the intolerance of the evangelical temperance movement, they found themselves sharing this particular goal. It is a fascinating note that the rhetoric used to achieve this end would often be the appeal to women and daughters harmed by drunk, violent, lecherous men. Vegetarianism is also of note here, especially given how frequently the topic came up in our previous review of occult feminism. Vegetarianism was, unusually perhaps, considered as a women's issue by a number of health reformers, who depicted the eating of meat as a form of male violence. Juliet Stillman once told a spiritualist convention, quote, "Even little songbirds do not escape his rapacity," end quote. Interestingly, this rhetorical trick continues to this day amongst certain vegetarians and vegans, especially feminist ones, who make claims about food animals being raped during artificial insemination, as well as continuing the lack of bodily freedom arguments concerning not only animal reproduction, but husbandry in general, in the form of controlling where animals go, what they eat and when, and even base biological functions, such as the removal of horn buds on young cows. Chapter 7. Chapter 7 starts with a fascinating observation, which I will read verbatim and then discuss. The paradoxes and tensions within spiritualism began to undermine its significance for women's rights and reform during the 1870s and 1880s. The movement that had played such a dramatic role in encouraging women's leadership saw the suppression of women within its own ranks. Spiritualists felt the same pull that drew other post-war reformers away from their radical past towards a more moderate application of individualist principles. Instead of calling for a restructuring of society based on the sovereignty of each individual, many reformers now campaigned for government control of personal behavior to eliminate specific vices. This is a very interesting observation, because it seems to mirror the various other waves of women's rights agitation. It may seemingly start as a call of individual liberty, but always devolves into "the government must make." Take modern examples. Women should be able to dress as they please. The government must take action against catcalling and the male gaze. Women should be able to hold any job that they are able to work towards. The government must set quotas and mandate DEI training and programs to get women into positions they want. Even more mundane things, and this one is rather topical to the release time of this particular review, women play video games too. The government needs to intervene and use DEI initiatives to force games to be a safe space for women. The same pattern, over a century apart. Women want always seems to devolve into the state must force. This combined with a newfound skepticism of spiritualism, sensationalists replacing trance speakers and fraudsters being revealed, and spiritualism's lack of focus on challenging gender roles all contributed to the muting and ultimate falling out of favour of this spiritual movement. There were continual arguments amongst spiritualists of all stripes regarding organisation. Spiritualism had often fallen into being a more individual affair, without centred orthodoxy. This would of course lead to problems with spreading such an ideology, because of a lack of shared vision and strategy to do so. This caused notable conflict. The spiritual freedom appealed to many, but would clash with zealous leaders who would promote and advocate for any measures to promote the cause. This antinomian approach would bias believers against structures and authority, and certain mediums' objections to organizations were part of an anarchist heritage they shared with antebellum radicals. Interestingly, the argument against organization by mediums and trance speakers morphed into an argument against men and masculinity. Amanda Brett made an argument against organization which seemed to sway the mediums at a meeting in Chicago in 1864, stating that she identified organization with positive, that is, masculine qualities and characteristics, and that these positive characteristics were not conducive to spirit communication with groups as well as individuals. This of course ties back to earlier observations regarding the positive and negative energies of masculine and feminine that spiritualism held to. At this point in time, rather than a necessary balance of the two, spiritualism was now increasingly devolving into accepting only the negative, receptive feminine as being of worth. I would like here to simply remind you of the male and female systems of Schaef 1981. This issue was highlighted at the Second National Convention Assembly in Philadelphia. Pro-organization factions moved immediately to force changes and make this a permanent association. Anti-organization forces, which included medium Cora Hatch, quote, trusted the attempt at organization would be a failure, end quote, and made clear her purpose at attending was to make it fail. Medium Melvina Townsend concurred, and a quote from page 166 again shows an anti-male, anti-masculine bias. Just so sure as we have an organization of faith, we shall have despotism, and not be allowed to speak what is objectionable to others, Townsend warned. Mediums understood that formal association threatened their role, because it recognized masculine leadership qualifications rather than the passive characteristics that linked mediumship and femininity. This plan is man's work, the production of men's brains. I see nothing of woman about this plan, complained Lizzie Dotton. Your organization will be a dead thing next year. It is said we shall have creeds if we adopt this plan, but we have better creeds than this. We are acting from policy, not principle. It should be noted here, although there was a notable anti-male streak, the issue of organization divided normal speakers from trance speakers more fully than it divided men and women. The chapter continues with further examples of these patterns, before noting that public divide, and how there were several examples of small-scale camps and fair-style trance-speaking spiritualist engagements outperforming larger, more organized events. However, it would appear that the mediums in this instance won a hollow victory. As Braude notes, a lot of the more modern trance-speaking attractions at these fairs relied more heavily on forms of female passivity, with few mediums taking to lecturing or even competent guidance of others, let alone speaking on behalf of their sex on socio-political topics. While the air of the event was the individualist streak of the former years of spiritualism and mediumship, it lacked the political motivation that marked the previous decades of the movement and its speakers. This would give rise to two of our ongoing project's larger names, Helena Blavatsky and Victoria Woodall, two women who would become associated with the spiritualist movement, and also the creation and evolution of theosophy, more as a form of self-aggrandizement. Indeed, one biographer of Blavatsky suggests that it was the popularity of spiritualism in the United States that led her to New York in 1873. The slip towards theosophy marked an important moment in the development of American spiritualism, as it would begin to bring into the fold opinions of occultism and the use of magic. Indeed, spiritualist Cora Hatch would, at a trance lecture, state that the word occultism was only a few months old and had been introduced by Olcott, one of the people associated with Blavatsky that we've mentioned before, and that this topic was being confused with spiritualism. As Braude notes, although Hatch's etymology may have been incorrect, she was correct in noting that American spiritualism had no association with the occult. Indeed, spiritualism believed there was nothing mysterious or even magical about spirit communication, mediumship, and trance-speaking. Even suggesting that there was an inherent discord between spiritualism's individualist nature, equally accessible to all, and the emphasis on the Gnostic elite society's secret knowledge and wisdom of occultism and theosophy. The remainder of the chapter concerns an interesting social struggle between spiritualism and the growing trend of Christian Science, which was mostly spearheaded by Protestantism at the time. We've mentioned this to some degree in previous book reviews. The most interesting of these points is a difference in theology mentioned on page 184. Christian Science rejected the spiritualist view that the continuity of life after death is proved by physical evidence of spirit presence. Spiritualists would assert we continue to have a body after death, whereas Christian Science supposed we never really had bodies to begin with, and the only part of a human that ever really existed was the spirit, both before and after death. You may recognize positions such as these from our previous talks about Gnosticism and transcendence. This led Christian Science to posit that God is all, God is good, God is the only reality, and whatever is not God is insubstantial or does not exist. This would lead to the conclusion that correct thoughts could change material conditions, and also to the notion that illness, pain, misfortune, etc. resulted from incorrect thoughts within the divine mind. Given previous discussion on this topic in other videos, most notably the book review on occult feminism and discussion streams on women's reality, I think covering this topic here might be extraneous, and you'll be best served watching those pieces of content. Conclusion. The book concludes with a short section condensing down the ideas contained within, noting the undeniable impact spiritualism had on the women's rights and suffrage movement, naming those involved, pointing to their meetings and publications, and listing out how and why this information seems to have been repressed by people later in the movement that would grow to become feminism in the modern day. In short, this spiritualist and religious underpinning to this modern socio-political movement is real and well documented. Indeed, the last 50 pages of this book is nothing but citations and references of primary sources used throughout the book, and I consider this book to not only have been an absolute joy to read, thoroughly informative and well worth seeking out in your own time, but to have also set the bar for how well sourced and cited a book of this manner should be. This should of course come as no surprise, since the author Dr. Ann Braude is the current Director of Women's Studies in Religion program and Senior Lecturer in American Religious History at Harvard Divinity. All things taken together, Radical Spirits is an excellent book, extensively documenting the spiritual origins of the feminist movement in the USA, and the mere existence of this book and the wealth of knowledge within it immediately gives lie to the notion that feminism is a materialist movement without an underlying metaphysic, and firmly demonstrates that anyone who would make a claim that this is not real feminism, or that religion has nothing to do with feminism, or even that feminism is not a religion, as being uneducated or unknowing on the topic, or outright lying for political expedience. Thank you for joining me for this book review and/or summary of Radical Spirits, Spiritualism and Women's Rights in 19th Century America by Ann Braude. This has been the third book in the series identifying and demonstrating that feminism is a religion and has very solid theological and metaphysical underpinnings that inform the entirety of the movement, from its inception to this very day, and how there seems to have been a worrying trend or desire to keep this history from public knowledge. In keeping with the theme of the American branch of spiritualism and returning to its influence on New Ageism, as we've mentioned in our previous two book reviews of occult feminism and women's reality, our next book will be American Feminism and the Birth of New Age Spirituality, Searching for the Higher Self, 1875 to 1915 by Catherine Tumber. Interestingly, the dates of this book title are of great interest, given that this book will in part pick up where Radical Spirits leaves off, and help cover the transitional period in the early 1900s to bring us up to a more modern era. With all that said, I shall leave off there saying thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen, and I shall see you next time.